Bill, are you there?
I'm here.
Can you
That
hear
was
me?
really freaky. That was like a ghost in the machine, like an
I feel
actual
like
ghost.
there was some weird electrical. So I did not prepare an introduction. So I'm just going to wing this because I feel like you don't even, well, you do need an introduction. You deserve an introduction. And obviously people know that you are a very well-known agent, literary agent now, and you're the author of 2 memoirs and a novel before this one. And then this one, which is The End of the Day. So short of a much more detailed introduction, tell us first, just tell us about the book. What's the book about?
The book is about, that's like actually the hardest question.
I
And you know it.
I know.
The book is about, I mean, at the center of it are 3 women who are in their late 60s, and they grew up in the same small town, basically. And 2 of them had been childhood best friends. And after the ages of like 18, didn't speak to each other for, almost 50 years, 49 years. And so the opening of the book is one of those women coming from New York back to the small town that they grew up in, and turning up in the driveway of her best friend who she hasn't spoken to in nearly half a century. And the reasons for that estrangement and the reasons that she's come that particular day are kind of what we come to find out like over the course of the book. Does that answer it?
Yes, it does. One of the things about this novel, I'm going to have you read a short piece after this, but what's so amazing reading this as a writer is I think somebody in one of the reviews said it was like a stained glass window full of little pieces, and then you step back and you see the whole. And what was so incredible was just that you start reading this novel and you just know that there are going to be all these secrets revealed and all these things are going to be, revealed. And yet it seemed like such an incredible feat of storytelling, because I would just tell it from the beginning and go straight to the end. But this was so incredibly woven together. But read a little for us, would you?
Well, thank you for that. I think some people might have preferred if I just told it from the beginning to the end. So, but it's not my way. So this is just from the beginning of the book. It's just a glimpse at a character named Jackie, who it's her house, it's her driveway that this former friend has turned up in, and so she's just waking up in her house. A vinyl shade slaps the window near the foot of her bed. From the basement, a slow ticking, the bang and shudder of the propane furnace. Outside, old tree limbs creak and pop above the single-story house. Robins and finches deliver the news of morning, but more loudly than usual, as if they are greeting sunlight for the very first time. Eyes closed, cheek pressed into the foam pillow she slept on for decades, Jackie curls onto her side toward the middle of the mattress. She rubs her feet together, circles the pillow with both arms, and burrows deeper into the familiar softness. The lingering fragrance of dryer sheets tugs her gently back across the gap between awake and sleep, where ghost sounds of crowded mornings fill her ears. Cabinet doors slamming shut, young voices tangling from the kitchen, a chair squeaking along the linoleum floor. An old, low flame of duty flickers to life. Lunches to pack, report cards to sign, laundry to graduate from the washing machine to the dryer, hamburger meat to move from the freezer to the refrigerator to thaw, a blouse to iron for work. A rapid-fire volley of shouts. Give it back, leave me alone, I'm telling Mom. A crow's mad caw fouls the air. Nah, nah! The shrill holler repeating. Jackie refuses to open her eyes, though the half-dream of facing a day busy with errands and work and children has gone. Nah, nah! The almost words feel like rocks thrown at her. She winces and pulls the bedding around her shoulders. The crow continues, its call bossier, more human. Now, it insists. Now, now. When it finally stops, Jackie listens for the noise of her squabbling children, both of whom have long since grown up and moved out. She tries to will the old feeling of too many demands on her time to return. But she only becomes more awake and aware of the morning as it actually is. The slapping shade, the tick and moan of the furnace, the straining hum of the refrigerator in the empty kitchen. And on the other side of her bedroom door, what is always there? Lifeless rooms and a day that does not need her. That's Jackie.
Yeah. You know, there's so many characters in this book, and I was wondering where they came from. Like where, you know, the novel is set in Wells, Connecticut, and is that a fictional?
It's a fake town. It's I made it up. It looks a lot like the town that I grew up in, which is called Sharon, Connecticut. It bears a little bit of a resemblance to the town that I'm in right now, which is called Barrytown, and it's just a small hamlet of a bigger town called Red Hook. But mainly it looks like Sharon. It looks like the town that I grew up in.
And so where did she come from? Like, where did the characters come from?
Well,
how did you get the idea to make this novel?
Yeah, I mean, Jackie comes from, actually, when I was writing Did You Ever Have a Family, there was a minor character who is a caterer, and he pulls into the driveway of his mother's house, and his mother comes out in a sort of a house coat and slippers, and that's Jackie. She appears for like a moment in that novel.
Oh, yeah.
And while I was writing the novel, I kind of kept on like going back to her and writing around her marriage and her childhood, and for a while I thought that she was going to be sort of part of the architecture of that book, and pretty soon it was clear that she wasn't. But and so I don't know what it's like when you write, but like I often write myself into corners where like I can't get out. And so when I would do that, I would just go into this file that had Jackie, and I would just write like easy pages of like her childhood friendships, like her parents. And there was all this stuff about her parents that didn't end up in the book. But so when I finished Did You Ever Have a Family, there was just this kind of like world of people that I was still puzzling through. But I hadn't really figured out anything. I didn't really think it was going to be a book, but then I overheard a story of this guy who said, he told the story of when he was young, he was at a picnic with his family, his young family, and had sort of run an errand and fallen in with a group of New Yorkers. I want to say this is in the 1970s, maybe. And the story that he was remembering, and they invited him to go party with them in a cabin. And he didn't come down from the cabin, which was up in the hills, for 2 months. And his family, and I was like, there's a lot of reasons why I was interested in that story and identified with it. Like, and somehow hearing that story like was like a spark, and I immediately sort of connected it to this whole kind of universe of backstory and character around Jackie, and that was the book. I could suddenly see the book, and that's what I was writing into.
So, you know, what was so interesting, many things were interesting. I have all these questions because, as you know, I have a lot of questions. But, you know, one of the main themes of the book is just all these secrets. And I couldn't help thinking when I was reading it that, you know, we have, so the big reveal to anyone who's watching is that you were my first agent.
Yes.
And back when, this was a long time ago, this was almost over 20 years ago, I was not your first author, but you were my first agent. And at the time that we parted professionally, probably over 10 years ago, you had this big secret. You had a secret that you were grappling with addiction.
Yeah.
And so I wondered how much of just that sense of secrecy or needing to keep a secret for the long time, because I had no idea when I knew you that was your secret. And most people didn't know anything. I was shocked, you know, to know, because it just was, was a very well kept secret until it wasn't, and then it wasn't. But
yeah. That was, it's a lot of people in recovery say, I didn't think anybody knew, and then when I got sober, everybody's like, believe me, we could see it coming a mile off. And so when I tell kind of the story of like when I was, really in the last years of my active addiction, I hesitate to say like it was a very well kept secret. It was something that I had lived a double life, and I was buckling under the weight of this other life. And when I left, which was basically I just walked out the door of my life one day. I just like disappeared into hotels, and I didn't intend to come back. But I hesitate to say like people were shocked because kind of in the world of recovery, like it's sort of like, of course they were. Like, but I think in my case, like I had become so good at covering my tracks, and it was not sustainable. And somebody had said around that time that like it was like the space shuttle exploding, like everybody saw and nothing was left. And nothing was left, like everything was gone. Relationship, like apartment, agency, clients, professional standing. I do think like in, the experience of a secret, like the burden of it, the thrill of it in the beginning, kind of feeling of getting over, of like figuring stuff out, all of that, like, I think, it bubbles up, in everything that I end up writing in some form or another, either like in a major way or in a minor key. And so yeah, it's like it was a defining experience of my life before I got sober.
Yeah, it's funny because the character in the book, Dana, seems to get a thrill of keeping these secrets, or kind of being the controller of the secrets for most of the time. But it was just an interesting sense also of the feeling that secrets are often wrapped in other secrets. And I don't want to give anything away in the novel, but it's sort of like life. It's like you think you know the answer. And and yet they're really, there's still more secrets. And so I think when I knew something was going on, what I thought wasn't what was happening, and so and to the extent that we can ever know anyone, because people always have secrets and all that. But I just thought that was really something. So, I remember that when we worked together a lot at the very beginning, I remember occasionally you would talk about writing. And obviously you were an agent, and you were with you started with an agency, and then you started your own agency before this one. And you occasionally talked about writing, but you occasionally would talk
I
about
don't remember that.
Writing. And so every now and then you would say something in a conversation. And it's funny because I was a publicist before I was a novelist. And I worked with writers too. And I was very, very careful about what I would say. And I think some people knew that I was writing, but I always felt like there should be a firewall because it was my job to do my job. And I felt very committed to doing my job. And so I think you were the same. I mean, you were definitely, committed to what your role was. But every now and then you would leak and say something. But then it was years and years and years. You didn't. So tell me, like, when did you start writing? Because
the thing is that I didn't write back then. So it's interesting to me that I would have said anything, but I have like journals from that time. And so like what I wrote, and this is like the kind of the grim truth of it, are like kind of like boozy impressions of like the Brooklyn Bridge, like coming back from like an edgy dinner in Cobble Hill. Like, do you know what I mean? Like I had no idea about anything like in my 20s. And so, and New York City, like was still, I came from a town with 1,500 people, like in the summer, and in the winter, I don't know how many people were there, but like, we were 20 minutes from the center of town that didn't have a stoplight. Like, so living in New York, and I had never living in Cambridge, Massachusetts for the summer before I came to New York, because I did the Radcliffe Publishing course at Harvard, was the first time I had ever lived in anything resembling a city. Like that's the most urban place I ever lived, because I went to college on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, very rural. And then, and I grew up in the small town. So when I was in New York, the city was kind of the thing I was responding to. And that's what I would kind of write about that. But it was like bad, like, you know, like Stingo in Sophie's Choice, like writing about like, you know, bad. But that's the only thing. And then before that, the summer after I got out of college, I remember writing these stories about, like, they were kind of like, it was like a rip off of like Paddle to the Sea. I now recognize, like, but that's it. Like, and I really didn't take it seriously. So, but you and I were like, I would have said something like that to you more than I would have anybody else, because we were very, very close. We were more like, I mean, it was like a lot of work and a lot of fun work, but like I would have been more likely to disclose something like that to you than most people.
Yeah. And so then, was it really after you got sober that you started to write? When did you really start?
Yeah. So when I wrote, so the first writing I did really was when I was in rehab. I remember I had been on the psych ward of Lenox Hill for weeks and weeks, and which is where I landed after that, you know, sort of long run, really, of like just leaving my life. And then I crashed very hard and ended up going to a small rehab in Westchester County. And I had kind of gotten some of my faculties like back by the time I got up there. And I had my friend David Gilbert, who you remember, drove me up there and took me to like a stationery shop before I checked in. And he got me those composition books, those with the black and the white. And he got me 3 of them and a bunch of pens. And I don't know what else he got me, but like, and I just had them and I filled them. Like and mostly what I was writing was what had happened over those months. Because, you know, I didn't sleep very much during that time. And I had hallucinations, and I like couldn't make sense of a lot of the things that I had remembered. And I thought if I wrote them down, they would make sense later. They don't make much sense, actually. But that was really the first time I had like, it just came out like a lightning streak. And then I didn't touch that for a long time. I got sober for a year. I went back to work a year later at the William Morris Agency and tried to put my career back together. And I lived in the summers and on the weekends with friends upstate. And at one point I went back into those composition books. I think it was when I moved. There was like a move, and I had been remembering stuff from my childhood at that point, and there was like things that seemed to speak to each other, and I remember sitting down and writing some of those memories from childhood, and there just suddenly was just this relationship between pieces from my childhood and that like, you know, 3-month period, which marked the end of my kind of active using, and that summer I just wrote. And Nick Flynn, who's a close friend, and it was his farm that I was living on with his wife Lily, and I gave them to him. It was 130 pages, and I gave them to him as the first thing I'd ever given anybody to read, like since like high school or college, and he carried those pages across the lawn. They lived in the barn, and my best friend John and I lived in the house. And I stood at the kitchen sink and watched him read those pages in a folding chair, and like I was on the verge of throwing up the entire time. And then he walked back to the house after reading them, and I almost ran. It was so devastating. And that was it. And then we had a long talk about it. And from that point, I wrote Portrait of an Addict as a Young Man. That was my first book. And that's really, that was it. It was sort of like, I didn't feel like I had a choice to write that. But the choice was to have it published. That was definitely a decision. And then
how did you reach that decision? Was it?
I felt like I talked a lot with Nick because he had written several memoirs at that point, and I think a lot of it was in recovery, like recognizing that some of my story was, there was some extreme parts of it, not to others, but to some. And I recognized the more that I like told my story all the way through, it helped people who had felt isolated in similar experiences. And so, having committed it to paper, that like if anybody, like if I had read my like story when I was young, it would have like blown my mind that anybody could go through any version of what I was going through at the time, which felt so incredibly isolating. And so that was really the reason. And then writing just became part of my life. I was well back to work at that point and busy, as an agent, and sort of just having some project of mine that like I was puzzling through, just became kind of, it was a very balancing thing. I mean, when I worked with you and before I got sober, I like the peaks and valleys of my clients' careers, the good reviews, the bad reviews, like the acclaim, the neglect, all that stuff I registered so powerfully. And I think I just like, there was an aspect of me that like, it was too important. It like I over-identified. It meant, and also I had my own ego wrapped up in it as well. So I felt vulnerable, and somehow writing kind of muted that a little bit, or just put it in kind of an appropriate place. And so I still get like furious when I feel like a writer I represent has been like misjudged or, maligned unfairly in a review, or if I don't feel like they're getting enough attention. But it's like, it's appropriate upset as opposed to like devastation or like insanity. And so like, so writing has in that way also kind of helped me do my job I feel like in a healthier way.
Well, I was going to say too, I mean, you're certainly not, I don't think you're definitely not the only agent who writes, but I would think that it gives you always had this incredible sympathy, like you just described. You really were like in it with me, and I'm sure with every writer that you work with. And so, but being a writer now gives you just even more ability to identify, I would think.
I definitely didn't understand the vulnerability. Like I didn't understand. And the mortification, like what it's like to actually like work very hard on something. And I don't think you can know until you've been through it. Like, and I don't think it's a requirement for the job. I don't think every agent needs to have to go through that. But I will say that there have been times, and like having an agent who writes is not for everyone. And happily, like, everybody knows that I do it. So like, I don't have to, it's like, if that's a self-selecting thing, like the people who it's not for, I never have to deal with, like, but for the people who it's for, like, I find there are moments where, you know what it's like, you publish books, it's like the highs are high and the lows can be so demoralizing and defeating. And I feel like I've had like pretty high highs and very low lows in the experience of publishing, of things that I've written. And I don't like deploy it very often, but like in moments where it's useful, I've found it to be very helpful. Even if I don't necessarily express it, I feel like I know how to like attend a moment like that, because it's very lonely. Like if like it can be just really lonely and isolating in those moments. And so so I think it's helpful. I mean, it is what it is. Like it's not going to change. I'll probably always write now. I don't want to right now. I have no desire to write at this particular minute, but I also know that I'll come back to it, and I'll a center of gravity will develop, and then there'll be something. So yeah, but happily I love my job. Like I don't, when I'm writing, it's usually up here by myself for like a week. And even then I'll return emails in the afternoon and phone calls. Sometimes people don't even know I've like left to write. And so I'll just wake up early in the morning and like write all the way through to like 1 o'clock. But yeah, it really it's the writing part, that just having that puzzle, I just love it.
Yeah, it's a great, when it's working, it's a great distraction. I know this summer I was working a little bit on something new, and it was such a great distraction because it just takes up your whole, you sort of blocks out everything. But one of the other things I think is so a theme of this book, anyways, just the outsider versus the insider thing, which you do so well. And I think because you grew up in a town where there were insiders, there were people with money and people didn't have money, or the whole New England thing where you either have it or you don't, and what class, there's this myth that there is no class system. Of course there is.
Yeah.
But that's also exists in publishing, the sense of like being in and being out, and you do that really, really well. And has being a parent, I mean, when you've written, did you write it for Vogue? I can't remember where you wrote a piece for Vogue in the spring.
Yeah.
So you adopted your niece.
We're in the middle of adopting. We haven't finished the process. The process has been a long one, but yeah, we took my niece in sort of kind of in an emergency situation, not really knowing at the time that it was going to be long term. It quickly became clear that it was going to be long term, and so she's been with us for a little over 4 years, and we're in the we talked to our lawyer today. Like, we're in the last, hopefully, phases of the adoption process.
Good. Yeah. And so has that affected your writing time too?
It affects everything. Like, I mean, what doesn't it affect? Nothing. Like, yeah, it's been like that whole, I was really deep into this book when she came, and then it stopped. Like, it stopped, and it stopped for over a year. Like, I couldn't, and I didn't even think, if I thought about it, it was fleetingly. But what was strange was that, like, I had already written this whole thing about, there's the story of this guy Hap who, and there's a child that is taken in, and and there's somebody chooses to raise this baby, and it's not, they didn't give birth to that child, and so and the experience of, like, raising a child that's not biologically your own, the implications of that, like a relationship with a step parent, the myth of having a real parent, all that stuff I had already written. And then, it was only when I went back into the pages, I was like, ooh, that's kind of some stuff that's going on right now. Like,
that's so weird. That was must have been sort of in your subconscious on some level, and how that would.
Yeah, it was really intense, and it changed a lot of how that, I think, unfolded. I rewrote a lot of that material, just based on, I think, being in the experience of raising a child that I chose to, that needed to be taken in. So yeah, heavy duty. Yeah.
And so, like, when you sat down to write this, getting back to like the structure of it, because again, like, I'm just like plotting, plodding, PLODDING, not plotting. But how did you decide to do it in such kaleidoscopic way, or whatever? How did you?
I think the thing, it really is intuitive to me to write in this way, where I think you've read this. I feel like I've talked to you about this book a long time ago, but Gene Stein wrote this book about Edie Sedgwick, and who was a socialite who became a model, who ended up dying in New York very young, and she went back and sort of interviewed everybody who was connected to her, and everybody had their own version of the story of Edie, and it's that, I think, had a big impact on me, in the sense that, like, there is no real truth. Like, the ultimate truth is unknowable. And so, like, I'll hear my sister talk about growing up in our family, and in our town. And sometimes I'm just like,
really?
But of course she's 100% right for her. Yeah. And so, I think being able to kind of look at events from various perspectives. I think when I stay inside a character and write from their perspective for a while, and other characters are named or mentioned or events come up, I have an impulse to go to another character and look at that event or even that character who's just been narrating and see it through their eyes and sort of and so I think there's just something intuitive in me that does that. And so I like the sensation of kind of circling a period of time or a set of events from different perspectives.
And over the course of one day. What about the difference between writing memoir and writing fiction?
Yeah, memoirs like
revisit the memoir. Are you going to write more memoir? Are you going to
maybe that essay for Vogue about my niece, it was the first time I had written like something like personal essay, any kind of memoir-y type writing.
Yeah.
And what I experienced in writing it was like a kind of like a reunion. I was like, oh right, like there's something about this that is really like meaningful and satisfying, like deeply satisfying. And because you run and especially raising a kid, like and having a job and living your life, and I was closing that piece. That piece was done, and then COVID hit, and we raced up here, and my husband was in Puerto Rico, and my niece and I were in the city, and I pulled her out of school and kind of like packed bags, didn't know what to bring, and then the editor of Vogue was like, I think it would be probably a good idea to write about this moment. And I was a little annoyed because it was the last thing I wanted to do. But even like being forced to kind of write like what the experience of that was like, I was grateful for, because I think the piece ended up better than it was. So I don't know if I will, but I feel like I might, and at some point, not right now. And so, but I did find that like really satisfying. And also feedback, like that's the kind of thing where I got more emails from that piece than probably any book I've ever written. And there is something, you've written personal essays, and you get that there's just something about like writing something that's useful to somebody or that they can identify with. There's it's very satisfying and meaningful.
It is. I wrote a modern love piece right around this time last year, about growing up in a family that I had a sister who died when I was just 3, and my older sister was 5, and the sister who died was the oldest of the 3 of us. And I wrote about what it was like to live in a family where it wasn't necessarily my loss, but I existed in this family that had suffered a loss. And it's so funny you say that, because the piece ran and I got so many emails, not just from strangers, from people I knew on social media who said they grew up in a family that had lost a sibling. Same sort of situation. They didn't necessarily know the sibling that well. It was either an older sister, young or whatever. And the family never talked about it. And just the piece allowed them to talk about it for like the first time. And these people
I remember that piece. That's an
30s
amazing
or 40s, and it seemed so interesting that, that it was a great feeling to feel like you could write something that just opened up a way for people to talk about stuff.
And that's such a specific circumstance like that, and being able to write that in a way that people could relate to and use as a juncture for talking about it, like you realize like, oh, like this is actually like a good use of me in the world right now. There's nothing better than that feeling. So
well, you said, I can't remember what interview it was. I think it was with Zibby, one of my favorite people, one of every writer's favorite people now is Zibby Owens.
She's nice.
So generous. But I think I was listening to that interview, and you did say something about your sobriety and feeling that you sort of taking on a new sense of being useful in the world, or being, and is that through your writing, or through your agenting and parenting? Is it all kind of
all of it? I think, also like when the period of time that led up to me getting sober, like because of also the way that I lived my life and the job that I had, I was connected to so many people. So many people depended on me. And so when I went down, it affected a lot of people. And then over the course of my getting sober, the people who spoke to me, like, which many didn't for a long time, I began to like hear and find out like what my impact had been on them, both like sort of toward the end of my using, and then just by my abandoning of them. And so I think when you like come to terms and reckon with like the negative impact that your life that you have had on another on not just another person but people, like it was important to me like to find a way to be useful. And the thing about recovery that's so amazing is that the way a lot of recovery works is like you kind of can't get sober alone. And so you end up like, even if you have 8 months sober or 8 weeks sober, you are helpful to the person who's like 8 minutes sober. And so that becomes a kind of training ground for being useful. It gives you self-esteem and it becomes a kind of oxygen. And so by the time I came back to work, and came back into relationships that had not existed for a long time, it was sort of like how that made sense to me, how I could occupy those relationships when a lot of damage had been done, was to like look at it through the lens of being useful. I sort of feel like everything in my life as somebody who's sober, like kind of has to like, that's the lens I have to kind of look at my world through. And so, yeah. And it's a complete, when you first start getting sober, people talk like this, and you're just like, actually, I just don't want to like smoke crack anymore. Like, I don't need to like renovate my life and become some saint, and I'm certainly not, but there is an aspect of that also like helps people stay sober. I've seen it time and again. It's just a spiritual shift. It's a complete different way of organizing one's way in the world.
And it seems also like a nice counterbalance to being a writer, being alone as a writer. And even though it's a great respite, to be alone from your family or from your job and to go into that place in your head,
Yeah.
Where writers go to write. It also seems like a good balance that you have these real connections with people outside of that.
Yeah. And you remember what publishing was like. It's like, it seems so very important. You know what I mean? Like, and people are just like crazy. And, there was a certain generation of people who, we both came of age with in publishing, who didn't have families, oftentimes didn't have partners or like marriages, or if they did have marriages, they didn't survive. And work was everything, and success and prestige and all these things. And as a young person coming into publishing, if you're in proximity to that, it becomes a worldview that you can swiftly adopt. And it's not a healthy way to live for me. And so I've definitely, by getting sober and being forced out of that world, like the year that I got sober, I had nobody in my life who was in publishing. And the few people who were in it or adjacent never spoke of it. It was too painful. Like I had lost too much. It was too. And so like, it just opened up the rest of the world to me, and then made it possible to return to it in a different way.
Well, it's really, I mean, I always want to, if I'm at now of course nobody goes anywhere, but in the recent past, I always would prefer to be seated next to someone who, I don't want to say was a failure, but had failed at something, or had the kind of life story that had just, that to me is like really interesting, to listen to someone's story and hear how they have really crashed and burned in a certain way and come back. And your story really is, I think, for people in general, and just as, writers, I mean, the fact that I'm sure there are people who write who are listening to this now, and the fact that you started writing relatively late. I mean, there's also this sense of like, you have to write in your 20s, you have to publish it, before you're 30. At least that was, like you just said, we came of age in the same sort of generation of publishing. Yeah. And that was the benchmark, was like, were you published by the time you were 30? If not, you were a failure. I slid under the wire at like 35 or something. But
Yeah.
It's ridiculous, really. But you kind of started later and have had, first as memoirs, and then, your first novel was nominated for the Booker. So, I mean, you've had this really unusual path that I think gives other people hope that you don't have to enter it in a certain way, or you don't have to follow a certain path, that your life can take a different shape, and you can get there. Do you have advice for writers?
I think just like jumping off of what you were saying is just to like really relax into whatever, if you're 50, like I just turned 50, like if you're 50 and like you feel for the first time like the impulse to write a novel, write the novel. Like there's just, write it. But like with all things, try and like disconnect from an expectation of what it will provoke, whether it be money or awards or fame or whatever it is. Like the thing about book publishing is that it's the craziest lottery in the world when it comes to all the success aspects of it, which is, this year proves it more than anything. People who've written novels for years and publications that had been planned for 18 months, like in advance, like meticulously planned in advance to launch like in early like April of 2020. And it's like, and everything was going right. And then a pandemic hit, and there's just nothing you can never anticipate that stuff. You can never anticipate sort of what is suddenly going to become relevant. And to just, it's okay to be disappointed if something like that happens, but you just also don't know. Like, I mean, I represent a writer named Hernan Diaz, who is a genius. And he had tried to get an agent and tried to get published. And even I had turned down his first novel, and but like recognized that he was talented, and invited him to send stuff back in. Anyway, he ended up submitting a novel off the public website of Coffee House Press. He's an academic, he's in his middle age, and the publisher, Chris Fishbach of Coffee House, just read the manuscript, called him, published it. And then it got published, and there were no real reviews. Nothing really happened. And then that was disappointing. It was like, and then he was a Pulitzer finalist. Like somebody had read his book and brought it into the Pulitzer committee, and then the New York Times ran a profile of him on the front page of the art section. The book has been selling since. And the truth about that is that if I had taken on his book at that time and sold him for a nice 6-figure amount to Random House or something, he would have gotten good reviews and maybe just been like, oh yeah, I'm aware of that book. But because everything he thought he wanted and that he should have, he didn't get when he wanted it, it created a narrative that then was, and the story on the front page of the New York Times was like, oh my God, how did we miss this? Wow. And it was just suddenly fully hatched as this masterpiece and this brilliant writer, and the rest, and now he has this major career. And so sometimes not getting what you want is the very best thing that can happen. And it's so hard to appreciate that in the points of disappointment. We all have that, but just, I would say to just try and do your best, at every part of it, artistically and then professionally. And then if it's not working or not on the timeline you want, that may be okay. That may be the best thing that ever happened.
That's so fun. That's such a great story. It sort of reminds me of how when I was first a writer, writing my first novel, and when you're writing your first novel, you never think anyone's going to see it because you're nobody and no one's going to see it anyway. And so it reminds me of, it was a sense of freedom, right? And then, then you have a contract and you are terrified because now someone's waiting for the thing. And it reminded me of this, when I went on a whale watch after college, a friend of mine took me on a whale watch, which 20 minutes out on the whale watch, I was the first person who got the only bathroom because I got sick on it was a 3-hour whale watch.
Of course.
Of course. And the boat made 2 motions. The first one was to chug, chug, chug to find the whale, which was very Awful. I was like, oh my God, please move, find another whale. And the other one was sitting and watching the whale. So there was these two, and every time the boat was still and swaying in the water, I wanted it to move. And every time the boat was moving, I wanted it to stop. And it was just misery both ways. And I feel like that's sort of like the writing thing. It's like when you don't have a contract, or when no one, there's a certain freedom in it because no one cares, and you can just feel free to write your thing. And on the other hand, you have all this anxiety that no one's ever going to see it or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's
and then they're paying attention, and God help you. Yeah.
Right.
I always remember the thing that, like, when you took animal husbandry to Joni Evans, like, and what did she say? Like, it was the funniest thing I've ever heard.
Oh, I can't remember.
I do.
What was it?
Oh, didn't she say, like, it's about, like, nothing?
Yeah, it's about nothing. Well, there you go.
But then it was like preempted for a lot of money, sold to the movies for like $1 million. Like, you know what I mean? It was like that thing that she said was nothing actually was to everybody else like something like that mattered a lot. So that's the other thing, is that you didn't give up when somebody who you respected, at the time, had said that it was nothing. Anyway. So
on that note,
so you don't give up. That's the key thing. Like,
right. Saved by the bell. Before we
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Hopefully there's no screeching this time. Thank you both so much for that conversation. That was great. I haven't laughed that much in a bit, so I really appreciate that. So to all of our audience members out there, now is the time for the Q&A. I have some questions to start us off, but if at any point you have some questions that you'd like to ask our wonderful authors, there's an Ask a Question button down at the bottom middle of the screen. So Laura and Bill, I have a question for both of you. Do you think that being writers and writing from different perspectives opens up your own perspective in a way because you're forced into these other kinds of consciousnesses?
Well, for me, I always seem to write from my own perspective, and mostly. And so, but within that, I do try to, I think now I see much more of the bigger picture. I think when I was writing my earlier novels, it was very much from an inside, my particular experience, and each phase that I was going through was both autobiographical and also, of course, fictionalized. But it was very much my kind of small-ish world view. And this last novel, I really tried to open it up a little bit more.
I definitely, after coming off of 2 memoirs, like writing from the perspective of other people was definitely a exhilarating experience. I definitely think it's like imagining into a point of view that is not your own, whether it be a different age, a different gender, class, place of origin. Like I've found it to be like an amazingly expanding experience. And then particularly outside my experience, like I'll do research and into as close as I can get to the kind of circumstances of, whatever that perspective is. And sort of doing that kind of research and reading around a particular place and time that a person might be coming from. There's just an enormous amount that one finds out. And I always think that that's an expanding thing. So I love it. It's scary because it's a risk. But I also, I find it deeply, deeply satisfying.
Thank you for that. And so that leads me actually to my follow-up question, Bill, which is, what is the most difficult character that you've written from?
Definitely Lupita in this book. And, she came into the country illegally from Mexico, and her father had come first, and then her, and then with her sister and mother. And so, which was a completely a circumstance that is very far from my own. And and you know, in some ways I found common ground with her as somebody who felt other in a small town. For me, it was queerness. For her, you know, it would be being like the only, you know, person of Mexican origin in a small, very white town in Connecticut. In those years also, where there wasn't internet and there wasn't ways to connect with other people who were having any kind of similar experience, very isolating, which was my experience. So in that thin strip of common ground, like I felt like I got to know her through also, you know, reading oral histories of people who had come into this country at her age in that time. And I had people who also came into this country at the same age, not that same time period, but at the same age as a kid, read it and give me feedback. And so I just felt like each time I got closer and closer to her. But like, I care a lot about that character, and I care anybody who has had a version of that experience or something that's like it. You know, my worst fear would be to offend them or to, you know, make them feel, not seen or exploited. And so that kind of, there was an anxiety with that and a sense of responsibility to it.
Thank you for sharing that. And Laura, your response made me really want to ask you the question, how do you feel about the phrase, all art is autobiographical?
It's funny because, you know, my first novel was about a woman who gets dumped and tries to figure out male behavior by studying animal behavior. And each subsequent book was sort of about a different phase. And I remember one of the many bad reviews I got for one of my novels, I think it was in the Boston Globe. And it was said something like, how unimaginative the novel was. Never want to read that about your thing. But it always made me feel like, oh, I have to imagine. And I have friends who really do write, you know, even, I mean, this novel very much is outside of what I would think you would write, or in certain ways. But I always tend to be grounded really in the world that I know. And that's, for some reason, that's just, even the book I'm writing now is very much, you know, of my experience. And that's just the way I think everybody has their own thing. I sort of wish sometimes that I had more of a bigger, I mean, my imagination works in littler ways within something, but it's hard for me to write something that's just outside of that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's definitely, I agree. It's all a spectrum of experience and how far outside our experience we go. We're not all fantasy writers. And so that actually leads me perfectly into my next question for you both, which is, as much as you can talk about it, what is next? What are your next projects? I mean, Bill, you touched on this some, but what gears are turning?
There's a character that's sort of come into view over the last couple of years, who, there's a family in both of the novels that's kind of like the working class family that's been in the town for generations. They're kind of the loudest, rowdiest family, like at the town picnics and stuff like that. Some of them are notorious, like, and it's like their last name, like, kind of comes with a certain kind of baggage. So I grew up with families like that in the town that I grew up in. And I remember even then, like, recognizing and that, like, you know, there were some kids who had uncles and parents who were really wild, and like, and they kind of had to live down their infamy. And so this family, they're called the Morris in the books, and they kind of occupy like the sort of the edge of the stories in both books. And I recognize a little bit that I think on some level I've animated them in a way that is, I've kind of spoken to kind of like the perception in the town of who they are. But so this character is a somebody who has grown up in that family, who's also closeted. I haven't written anybody who's like gay from that town, which I only really recognized in the last year and am somewhat mortified by. And so, but it's weird. Like, and you're asking about like writing away from your experience. Like right now, like it's a woman, and I feel like I'm much more comfortable writing from a female perspective than a male perspective. And this one, which is the closest to me of any, like, because she's closeted and queer and goes up in the town, like, it's like I can already feel myself uncomfortable, but also kind of excited to like lean into that. But I don't really. I've written some of her, and I'm kind of thinking about her more than writing her, and I don't think I'm going to really be writing anytime soon. It's like, it's not a time for writing. It's like a time for mulling, I think, for a while. That makes sense. Definitely.
Yeah.
What about for you, Laura?
Yeah. So my next novel is called Small World. And that's the name of the Nextdoor app, the Nextdoor site where people trade, local, like a listserv.
Oh, I don't know about this.
I don't know about that.
Nextdoor. Do you know what Nextdoor is?
I don't.
So Nextdoor, it's like an app. It's like a community, and it's like, where's the best pizza, or hey, stop.
Okay.
Your compost in my yard, or there are raccoons, and I don't like I don't like the light that you leave on. It's this whole neighborhood thing. So Small World is that version of that for the novel, but it's about two sisters who, one sister moved away right after college and moves back and moves in with the other sister. So it's two sisters, grown up, divorced, no kids, who end up living together as adults and kind of looking at their childhood, which is will be similar to my childhood. I was trying to write a memoir about growing up here and moving back here after living in New York for a long time, and what it was like to lose this sister and grow up in a family of loss like that. And she lived in an institution that was one of the first institutions. It was called the Fernald School for Retarded Children, and it was initially called the Fernald School for the Feeble-Minded. It was one of the first. I think it was one of the institutions in the country here, and it was taken over by the Shriver Institute. I think it's completely deserted now, but anyway, it was sort of this fascinating. But there just wasn't enough for a novel, for a memoir. And so I'm going to really I've done some research, and I'm sort of, so the two sisters move in together as adults and try to kind of figure out their childhood, all while there are new neighbors upstairs who are basically teaching yoga above their heads, which is what happened to us 2 years ago. The tenant moved out, we rent in Cambridge, and in moved these two people. And it was weird because like a month went by, we started to hear all this weird noise upstairs, and we were like, God, some Tuesdays and Thursday nights, there's all this. How many parties a week? How many parties a month? What is going on? We knew it wasn't set. We knew what it wasn't, but we couldn't figure out what it was. And then a few months after they moved in, they had us up for tea. And it was the kind of thing where, like, their apartment looked like our apartment. And so you're like, oh yeah, we have a closet and you have a closet. And that bathroom, we also have a bathroom. And then it was like, oh, where the living room was like a yoga studio. It looked like if you had blindfolded us and taken us up the stairs, we had just entered like the yoga zone. It was like a real, and so every week, twice a week, 7 people. I mean, I'm in the room where the yoga studio, it's small. It's just a room in a house. And so every week, right above our heads, we were downstairs watching Rachel Maddow, watching the world collapse. And upstairs, it was like 7 people, not 2, 7, plus the teacher. You hear all, Shavasana, and they would be laughing, they'd fall asleep, the blankets, everything. And we were like, what do you mean? So this went on for like 2 years. So that's going on with the sisters. And so that's the funny part. So the dead sister and then the yoga people. So it'll be a nice balance.
I'm excited. Yeah. That's so great.
I haven't quite figured out how the app fits in, but we'll figure
I'm definitely looking forward to that.
Yeah. I know. I can read it.
And so my last question for you both, and again, to all of our audience members, if you have any questions, now is your last chance, I suppose. And then after this, I suppose we'll end if there aren't any audience questions. My last question is my favorite to ask authors who I'm talking with or asking questions to, and it's, what is on your bedside table for your reading right now?
Hardest question. I mean, I just finished Bill's book, which I loved. I just finished Alice Hoffman's book, her new book, Magic Lessons, which I loved. I read so, and I'm sure your answer is a little bit similar, but I read so much for either blurbs or, I mean, I just finished reading Anne Leary's new novel, which is going to come out in probably a year or so, which is an amazing novel, a historical novel. So I feel like I've read stuff that I can't, you know.
You can't talk about exactly.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I'm reading a manuscript right now, which is so like, it's such a bummer to say, because it's like it's like an English writer who hasn't been published before, and it's about growing up on the Guernsey, in the Guernsey Islands. Like, do you know?
Oh, cool.
And it's, they're linked stories, and so I'm reading that. But before that, I don't know. Like there's been yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, the book this year that it was this year, the beginning of the year, that I just loved is City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert. I loved that book. I was so surprised by that book. I can't recommend it like more strongly. And I think because she's so popular, she's like a, you know, she's like a movement, you know, in addition to being a serious writer. There, I think on some level, like critically, she doesn't get like the kind of like the respect that she deserves. But that book is like no less than like it's like this epic history of women in the last century. And it's amazing. I mean, it just covers, it's from the 1940s right up to the present. And it's like about homosexuality, the evolution of cities, like family, class, and it's genius. It's like, Laura, I think you would love it. It's like, it's so good. So, I find myself recommending that book a lot, like just because, and nobody who I've recommended it to hasn't come back to me to say like anything less than like, I can't believe that book. Like, it's that good.
Wow.
So
That was a great review. I'm definitely going to have to check that out now. Thank you so much.
I can't recommend it more strongly.
It's almost like you should sell books. So thank you so much. You both have been such a delight this evening. And to all of our audience members out there, if you're interested in reading either Bill or Laura's books, you can click on the handy buy the book button and it will take you magically to the Oblong Books website where you can get signed copies of books as well. And we really appreciate all of our supporters during this holiday season, which is an especially difficult one. So thank you both so much. You've been such a delight to have. And I just want to remind everyone that our next Oblong online event is December 3rd with Gary Trudeau for his 50th anniversary of the Doonesbury comics. And that is how we are ending our Oblong online season for 2020. Did either of you have any parting words before we sign off?
No. Thank you for having me. And Bill, it was great.
This was so much fun. I really enjoyed catching up with you, and thank you for doing it, and thank you for having us. It's been great. And everybody out there, buy Laura's book, Separation Anxiety. Is so genius, and so actually, Laura's very funny, like that's a given, but it's devastating and so moving. So I can't recommend it more highly. I read it a long time ago. When did it come out? April?
March, right.
Oh, March.
Fine.
What book would Laura's book have come out? What month would it have Laura's book? March would have been the month. Like that. Yeah.
A pandemic.
Tour might have been canceled. Oh, Laura's.
That's the one.
That's me.
It's so good, though. It's so good. Is it in paperback yet?
It is just coming out. I always had a copy, but it's under it's just coming out in paperback. Yep.
Buy it, guys. It's so good.
A really great cover. Also, just a side note. Well, thank you so much again, and I hope you both have a great evening.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.